welcome back to the e4 for black series, and we're always just going to respond to e4 with e5. The most common continuation is white bringing this knight out and just attacking this pawn. Very simple. This pawn is undefended in the center of the board, and white's just attacking it, and we're always just going to respond by developing our own knight and defending our pawn. White has a lot of options here. White can just play d4. This is called the Scotch. He can play c3, preparing d4, making it even stronger, making this big pawn chain here. He can also play what we're going to look at today, bishop to b5. This is the Spanish, or the Ruy Lopez. We looked at in the last video playing Morphy's pawn. This is pawn to a6. This move was first played by Paul Morphy. Just attacking this bishop and asking it, do you want to exchange off, which is what we looked at in the last video with tactics like playing queen to d4. But today we're going to look at the main line, which is going back to a4. Whenever we see this move, we're going to play knight to f6. Now our knights control every single center square, and we're also attacking white's undefended e4 pawn. Notice here that this tactic still remains, that if white tries to take off our knight and take our e5 pawn, we can still play queen to d4 here, attacking this pawn, attacking this knight. This knight has to go back, and we can take castling rights from white. So we bring out our knight, and now we see that white can castle here, and let's just say that they do. We have to realize now that this bishop takes knight threat comes with a little more sting, because our queen to d4 move doesn't really have the same effect with the king over here. We can't really take this pawn with check, forcing white to give up castling rights. It doesn't really have the same punch to it. Now, because of that, we're going to play b5 here and disconnect this bishop from this knight. The only move here is to go back to b3. Now let's take a look at our position for a second. We have a choice to make here. We could take this center pawn and maybe push defending our knight and trying to hold on to that one pawn advantage, because this pawn right here is undefended in the center of the board. But we also realize that we're 2 moves away from castling, whereas white is fully castled. So instead of going for extra material, we should probably go and get our king safe like white's king is. Now, when we think about where we want to develop this bishop, we could bring it to e7, but I feel like that looks a little passive. I like the idea of playing bishop to c5. Now, this is the starting position of the Archangel variation. I think it's actually Archangelisk or something like that, but I don't want to say that, so I'm going to say Archangel. Now this bishop controls this d4 square and further prevents white from playing d4 himself. If he wants to play d4, he'll have to probably prepare it with something like c3, which we'll look at in the next video. The bishop also is now lined up with the king and pins this pawn, making g3 a potentially weak square if white ever wants to give his king luft with h3. Maybe something like knight to h5 and then knight to g3 would be a good idea. Now let's look at a couple of replies for white. I think the 2 most common replies would either be d3 or c3. We could look at the variation where knight takes pawn, and there's also a4. So in this video, we'll cover these 2 variations. First, let's look at knight takes pawn. We'll take back with our knight, and the idea is to fork us on d4. So we're always going to take this pawn with the bishop, and white has to take back with the queen. We're now going to push our pawn to d6. This just defends the knight and allows the bishop to come out either way. If white plays something careless here, like developing the bishop or developing the knight, we can now push c5, kicking this queen away, and now playing c4 and trapping in this bishop. And even if white makes a little retreat square, we can still kick the bishop away and have a pretty good position. Now let's look at d3. d3 is a nice move because it protects e4, which is no longer hanging, and it also allows this bishop to come out. I can see that I can castle now, but I would rather take this moment to fortify my center with something like d6, which is also preparing my last minor piece to get developed. Now that it's white's move, let's look at what undeveloped pieces he has. He's either going to develop this bishop or this knight. If this knight comes to d2, he might seem a little lost because he can't go to any of these occupied squares, and this square is threatened by my pawn. Not only this, but he's holding this bishop in. So white will probably play knight to c3, or he'll bring this bishop out. Let's think about the life of this bishop. This bishop is definitely not going to h6, and it's definitely not going to f4. It could go to g5, and it could go and get traded off on e3. And if white wanted to be really passive, he could just develop it to e2. Let's look at the most aggressive response, bishop to g5. Whenever we see this bishop, we're just going to play a Morphy's pawn style attack, just like we did on this side. We play h6. Most people are going to go back, but if white does want to take here, we can just take back with the queen, and black's position is very good here. Most people would go back, and now we're going to hit this bishop with g5. So this looks a little scary here that white could potentially sack and then have a nice pin against this queen, but this is going to be nullified after rook to g8. There's no hanging on to this bishop because we can just sacrifice the exchange and play something like bishop to g4, and there's no pushing this pawn because it's pinned by our bishop. So there's no real sacrifice here. White would have to go back. And now we just have this very simple plan of playing h5 and h4 and attacking this bishop again. We realize when we play h5, obviously we're giving up this pawn and we're just inviting white to take it. We're just going to push our pawn again, and we realize that we have 1, 2 attackers on f7, and white could come down with a fork and attack our queen. We are actually going to give up our queen. So if knight takes queen, we have this super fun counter, bishop to g4. And now this is actually an even position, but this position is super hard to play for white. White realizes he can't push this pawn because it's pinned by this bishop, and his queen is now under attack. White is most likely thinking in this position, he just got away with a free queen. So long as he just moves his queen away, he should be able to win this game. So white is looking to move his queen. There's 3 spots that white can put his queen, and no matter where he brings his queen, we're going to respond with this move, knight to d4. This is looking right into white's base, and white quickly realizes that black has a lot of pressure by his king, and there's not a lot of pieces by white's king to protect. There's no taking this pawn too, because this would be checkmate. And there's no taking this way either, because then this would be an unstoppable checkmate. If white were to play something like knight c3, there's just no stopping the sacrifice on f3. If you push this pawn, just taking it. If you do nothing, then this is checkmate. And there's no taking this way because of this pin. So let's go back. So let's say queen to e1. And now we play knight to d4 with the idea of going knight f6, pawn takes, bishop takes, and there's no stopping these checkmates. There's just way too much pressure from black's pieces. For instance, if pawn takes pawn, we can just play knight to f3, forking the king and queen. Let's say white takes, we could just take back with the bishop, and there's no avoiding this checkmate. If pawn takes the other way, then this is checkmate as well. Let's say a knight comes to d2, trying to protect this f3 square. We can now just chop off this h2 pawn. There's no taking this pawn because this would be checkmate. Even pushing the pawn, checkmate. And now let's say they try to kick your knight away with something like c3. You could just jump in with knight to e2, and this is going to get your queen back. Now white's rook is attacked and it can't move because of this nasty check. And white's knight is also attacked. Black's general plan here could be to get this knight, lift the king, bring this rook over to the h-file, and checkmate white on the first rank. So if we go back, now let's look at if the queen goes to c1. We can play that same move, knight to d4, and all the same checkmates apply. Even if white tries to defend by playing something like h3, we could still counter by playing something like knight e2, forcing the king over. And now we don't have to take with this bishop, we could take with this rook too. White has to take the rook, and now we have checkmate with bishop f3. So when you get this combination of this knight controlling e2, controlling f3, this bishop pinning this pawn to the king. This bishop shuts out the queen. This rook attacks this half-open file. It's just too many pieces attacking at once and just has this lone rook to defend. So let's look at one more variation. If the queen goes to d2, let's play knight to d4. Look, if h3, we can just play here, here. Or if he just plays c3, we can just obviously jump in with knight to f3, takes, and there's no stopping this checkmate. So the best way to play this with white actually is just taking the knight on c6, completely giving up your queen. So black takes the queen. Now instead of taking back right away, which is kind of allowing this nice check, white first plays d4. Black has to know here if he goes back, he's pretty much completely lost. After something like pawn takes pawn, there's just too much pressure from white's position. So black has to know to play bishop e2 here now, but this is so specific. So let's get back to the main line. What is up, guys? If you got this far into the video, welcome to late night bonus lines. We're looking at lines inside of e4. We always play e5, and they always bring out this knight trying to attack our pawn, and we're defending from here. We're just doing a little recap. We're going right into the Spanish, or the Ruy Lopez, when they play bishop to b5, and we're always going to hit that pawn with a6. They opt to go into the main line, back to a4, and now we bring out our other knight. White usually castles here, and this is our time to kick the bishop away and play the Archangel variation. Every time they play d3, trying to get this big pawn chain, we're just going to play d6 and match them. We're giving them the opportunity to play bishop g5 because we have a little bag of tricks in store. We play h6, the bishop goes back, and now we strike with g5. We saw that there's no sacrifices here, so when the bishop goes back to g3, let's look at a couple other variations that white could play here. One of the most obvious is h3, giving an escape square for this bishop, and now we can just kick the bishop back into that square. Now we can strike on the knight with g4, and if white opts to take our pawn, we can play bishop g4. White is probably going to have some difficulties dealing with this pin on the queen. Now if the knight moves away, let's look at d2 first. Either way the knight moves, we can just chop off this pawn. White can't take back because then g8 and taking on h3 is going to be pretty bad for white. White can instead push this pawn, but now we're going to play bishop to g4. And remember, there's no pushing this pawn because the pawn is pinned. White can try to block with his knight, but we always have this move, knight to d4, and white's position is falling apart from here. But how can we add pressure to this position when white plays something like knight b to d2? White has two defenders on this knight, and we have two attackers. We can add one more attacker to this knight by getting this queen involved. We're going to bring this queen to f6. So first we're going to take this knight off this square. Now where can we put this knight? We can either bring this knight back to d7, or if we're feeling brave, we can take this pawn on e4. When white takes back, we can clarify the situation by taking on f3, and then we can play queen to f6. Now we have two attackers on this pinned piece and only one defender. But if we don't want to, we don't have to sacrifice the piece, and we can go back to d7, playing f6 on the next move. Even if white's knight came to g5 attacking our f7 pawn, we still have too much pressure here that we can just take this h3 pawn. Let's say white tries to fork our pieces, we could just move our queen away. We just have too much pressure after something like queen to g7. Even if white pushes his pawn, we can still just take it. This pawn is pinned, and something like this would be checkmate. So when we go back to this position, we can see that white really has to prevent this move h4, and he can do that by playing h4 himself. Whenever we see this, we realize that white has now permanently given up control of this g4 square because there's no pawn to protect it. And as for now, this pawn is pinned, so this pawn can't come up and protect that square as well. So right now g4 is very weak, and we can just throw our bishop into this square, pinning this knight to the queen. On our next move, we're looking to play knight to d4 and overload this knight. White can prevent this though by playing c3. Now let's think about where this knight can possibly go in the future. All of our minor pieces are out. How can we advance? Well, white kind of just shut down these two squares, so our knight can't really go to these two squares. This e5 square is also controlled by our own pawn, so there's no going there. And there's no use going to a5 because the bishop can just retreat. So our best way to advance this knight is probably going to be going to e7. The main idea is going to g6, maybe with the idea of attacking this pawn. We actually don't care if white takes this pawn, because now we can go back to h7 with our pawn and attack white's pawn on g5. Now they're opening up lines on their king side, and if we can take this pawn on the next move, we can start to overload this knight. So just know if they ever push h4, you now have this g4 square for your bishop, and you're going to try to get your knight into d4. If you can't do that, try to reroute your knight to e7 and then to g6, trying to open up lines on the king side. Now if white goes to take our g-pawn immediately here, we have this really nice attack with h4. We're attacking white's dark square bishop, and he has to go back. He can't take because this knight is pinned. So once the bishop goes back, we can push h3. Let's say white goes to take our pawn. We don't want to take with this bishop because this bishop is maintaining this pin, so we're going to take with the rook. We're now attacking this knight twice, and one of the ways that white can defend this knight is by playing knight b to d2. We can now once again attack that knight by playing knight to d4, and now we have 1, 2, 3 attackers on this knight. White only has 1, 2 defenders. The most obvious way he can add a defender here is playing king to g2. We can trade knights off here, and then when white takes back, we can take this knight with our bishop. It's fine to leave our rook hanging, because if white takes it, we can play queen to d7, and this is going to be checkmate. So if we go back, white is forced to give up the queen here. And now finally we can move our knight out of danger. Keep in mind here that white also has no time to take our knight, because we're going to take back with the queen, and now we just have too much pressure on white's king side. So let's say that after the bishop goes back and we push this pawn, instead of taking our pawn, white opts to push his pawn. We can leave this knight here again, just as bait to launch our queen into the attack, and we can play knight to d4 here. Because white played g3, he no longer has a g2 pawn that can protect this knight. So we're just going to add pressure to the pinned piece with knight to d4. The most obvious response is to play knight to d2, and now we can just bring our knight back to h7 and make sure it's safe. On our next move, we're going to play knight to g5 and basically have all of our pieces attacking this f3 knight. Maybe potentially bringing our queen into f6 and our rook to g8. And that's enough for now. I'm going to go to bed. Have a good night.